My name is Melissa Estes Blair. I am an associate professor of history and department chair of the history department at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. And I'm speaking today about my new book, which is called Bringing Home the White House: The Hidden History of Women Who Shaped the Presidency in the 20th Century. Before then, there had always been sort of like, ever since the 19th Amendment in 1920, the campaigns would sort of organize someone to organize women voters for the campaign, and then that structure would go away and it would be recreated 4 years later. So Dewson is critically important in the story that I tell in the book because she makes the women's division a permanent feature of the DNC. The RNC similarly adopts a permanent women's division structure also in the 1930s. All the other women that I write about, both the other three Democrats, the last of whom is Edwards, and also the one Republican that I write about, who's the woman on the cover of the book, if you look at the book, sitting in the Oval Office with Eisenhower. All of these women build on or in the case of Bertha Adkins, the Republican, copy the structures that Dewson builds in the early 1930s in the DNC. So she's really critically important. So much of what India Edwards does that we're going to talk about is building on those foundations that Dewson built during FDR's first term. Dewson retires after the 36 campaign. She is replaced by her hand-picked successor of Dorothy McAllister. McAllister's from Grand Rapids, Michigan. She did not know the Roosevelts before, and so her taking over is really important to making this like a permanent job and not just something that's sort of in the Roosevelts' personal circle. McAllister serves through the 1940 campaign. She then hands the baton to a woman named Gladys Tillett from North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina. Tillett serves throughout World War II. And then when Tillett steps down in 47, she stays through into 47. That's when India Edwards takes over, who we're going to talk a lot more about. And then when the Democrats leave the White House in 52, there's a woman named Bertha Adkins, who I mentioned, who does very, very similar work for the Republican Party throughout Eisenhower's presidency. So I wanted to sort of start there because the book isn't only a story about India Edwards, and she's not operating in a vacuum. She's very much building on the precedents that had been set by her three predecessors. And she and Bertha Adkins, the Republican woman who comes in with Eisenhower, were good friends. They talked a lot. They collaborated. They were often speaking at the same events. And so this is very much a network of women and a community of political women. And I saw the note to turn up my volume. I'm trying to get closer to my microphone, which is all I can do. So I hope that helped at least a little bit, and I'll try to be a little bit louder. The one other note I want to say about these women as a group before I really do a deep dive into Edwards is that none of these women's private lives match what you would necessarily expect for the private lives of women working in Washington in the middle of the 20th century. Both Dewson and Adkins, so the first woman who was good friends with the Roosevelts and the woman who worked for Eisenhower, were both lesbians and both in long-term partnerships for decades. McAllister and Tillett both still have school-age children at home when they're doing this work. McAllister is particularly fascinating. Her husband is a Michigan Supreme Court judge. She moves to DC with her daughters, and I have her in the 1940 census living in Alexandria. Somebody on here said they were from Alexandria. Living in Alexandria in the 1940 census listed as head of household with her two daughters aged 14 and 10. So she is functionally a single mother while she's doing this work and getting Roosevelt elected president for the third time, which is really remarkable. Edwards, who worked for Truman, who I'm going to talk about, seems on the surface to sort of fit what you would expect the most. She's doing the work that we're going to talk about after her children are grown. But that doesn't give the whole picture of her career either. She was an editor of the women's and society pages of the Chicago Tribune for about a decade before she gets into political work. while her children are still at home. Once her kids start school, she goes back to work at the Tribune. So all of these are women who are sort of merging family obligations and their work lives, which I think is important to sort of to note and to call out, because I think it's really interesting. I have a 13-year-old daughter, so I'm always particularly in awe of the fact that Dorothy McAllister is getting two girls, roughly the age of my daughter, out the door every morning, and then going across the river to run this campaign. Okay, so now I'm going to try to share my screen so that you guys can see a few pictures. Host has disabled screen sharing. Azalea, do you have those slides that I sent you? Okay, she's going to pull those up for me. And we will get into the meat of our talk. While she is pulling that up, and hopefully we'll get some pictures. So what the Women's Division did, I'll sort of just talk generally a little bit as we're getting the pictures pulled up here about this work. The job of the Women's Division was really to be sort of the grassroots network of the Democratic Party. When Molly Dewson is first building this network, she very deliberately does not focus her effort in the places where the Democratic Party was already strong. So there's not a huge Women's Division presence in really big cities like Chicago and New York, for example. The Democratic Party was already really strong there. They didn't need the grassroots network of the Women's Division. And so instead, Dewson and her followers are going everywhere else. They're going to rural areas, they're going to small towns. Some of the feedback, there's a couple of file folders that I saw at the FDR library from the 1936 campaign, where they're getting feedback from women in small town Iowa, in Lexington, Kentucky, in cities and towns all over the country. So this is a network. By the time India Edwards takes over this work in 1947, this is a network of tens of thousands of women nationwide who have been sort of coming together for over a decade. By the time Edwards takes on the leadership of the division, and they have two primary tasks. Their first task is to be, and both women of both parties use this phrase, the saleswomen of the party. It is their job to go out. Yeah, if you can make me the host again, that would be great. Their job is to go out and convince everybody. And throughout this period, they're never just speaking to women voters. They are always trying to reach all undeclared voters to persuade them to vote for the Democratic Party. Let me see one share. Let me see if this is good. Hey, there we go. All righty, pictures. Nope, not that one. Why did it do that one? Hang on. Sorry, friends. Where did it go? Ah, here we go. You are sharing the screen. All right. Can you all see my slides? Somebody give me a nod. Yes. All right, good. I can't see them, so I'm glad you all can. I can't tell that you all can. Okay. So let's do this slideshow. Slideshow from beginning. There we go. Okay, there we go. Now we're cooking. All righty. So women are being tasked with going out and convincing all undecided voters, regardless of whether they're male or female, to support the Democrats in the case that we're talking about. And we're going to focus here, obviously, on the 48 campaign. And so we're going to start with talking about that picture on the right. One of Edwards' real innovations of the campaign was to develop these things called Housewives for Truman trailers. These were deployed in 8 swing states. And how this worked is that the women would go, if you can't probably read the fine print, but right here on the back of that Airstream trailer, it says Women's Division, New York State Democratic Committee. So each state would that was identified would send these women out. And what they're doing is highlighting one of the big issues of the campaign, which was inflation. This is fun to talk about these days, where inflation is playing a big role in a presidential campaign. The Republicans had gained control of the House of Representatives in the 46 midterm elections. Once they're actually in charge in Congress in early 1947, they end the remaining price controls that had still been in place from World War II. So there were still some sort of price caps as late as the end of 1946, sort of left over from the war. And the Republicans lift all of those immediately upon taking power in January of 47, and prices immediately start to go up. And so the main job of the women's division under India Edwards, and that's her sitting down there with Truman in the picture on the left, the main job of India Edwards and the women's division, as Edwards conceives it, one of the things about the women's division is they really came up with their own talking points, their own approaches. They run a very independent part of the campaign. The whole campaign's talking about inflation, but Edwards is going to have the women's division do it in a particular way. And what she decides to do is to have the women's division highlight the impact of inflation in incredibly concrete terms. So in every town that has one of these housewives for Truman trailers, some women, Democratic Party volunteers, would go grocery shopping the morning that the trailer is going to be set up in town. They would buy a bag of groceries, they'd bring their receipt back to the trailer, and they would get a little chalkboard that would stand next to the door as you walked up into the trailer, and they would write down how much they paid for all of those products that day in September, October. That's the order those months go in. August, September, October of 48. How much they paid for them then versus how much you would have paid for them at the end of 1946 when the price controls were still in place. They just write it down. And then they eventually, the trailer was set up for most of the day. You could come in, you could pick up literature to hand out to your neighbors. One of the things that Dewson starts doing in 32 that persists throughout all of these campaigns is using these big sort of like legal size piece of paper broadsides called rainbow flyers, which are totally written by women's division staff. So you could come and pick up some rainbow flyers about different talking points. You could sign up for an event, but that chalkboard was there sort of really smacking you in the face with how much prices had gone up in the year and a half since price controls had been lifted. And then in the late afternoon, there would always be some speeches, a woman from the women's division, some local candidates for office. There would be some speeches, and then the trailer would move on and they'd do it all again a couple days later. So this is a great way of sort of dramatizing the issue of inflation in those 8 states, in those communities where the trailers are. But Edwards knows that this needs to be something that all women voters are hearing about all the time. And so in September, she sends a letter to the Democratic County chairwomen in 15 major cities, Cleveland, Dallas, San Francisco, big cities. And in that letter, there is a calendar, 2 days a week for the last month of the campaign. And for each day, there's 3 cities listed and like 4 items. And I'm making up like the dates and the cities here, but this is basically how it worked. So on, say, October 14th, she wanted women in Kansas City, which is on the list, Kansas City, Chicago, and Portland, Oregon, to shop for pork chops, green beans, and milk. Write down how much they paid, and then send a telegram with that information about how much they paid that day to the Women's Division headquarters in Washington. The telegram is my favorite detail of this entire story. Just how the technology had to work to make this work. It would be so much easier to do this today. But she's writing a letter a month in advance, giving everybody their schedule. On their designated day, they do their shopping, they send their telegram, and that information is then folded into the script of a radio address that Edwards and other speakers from the Women's Division record that airs the next day. They air 2 radio programs a week for the last month of the campaign. And all of them sort of talk about inflation and highlight this issue. And the work that Edwards is doing dovetails perfectly with how Truman himself is talking about inflation and how these issues tie in to the broader geopolitics of the era. In the speech where Truman announces the policy that's going to come to be known as the Truman Doctrine in March of 1947, he has this lovely line in that speech where he says, "The seeds of totalitarianism are sown in misery and want." he draws a direct line between poverty and the appeal of communism in the early Cold War. And so to have that as one of the things that we're talking about, and then have the women's division come and be like, look at how much harder it's getting for women to feed their families, and sort of banging that drum over and over again. It works really, really well. And as most of you on here probably know, Truman was not supposed to win in 1948, right? The Democratic Party is fracturing. Strom Thurmond from South Carolina has led a walkout of white supremacist segregationist Democrats out of the Democratic Party convention. He's running on a third-party Dixiecrat ticket. To Truman's left, there's Henry Wallace running on the Progressive Party ticket. So the Democratic Party has split into thirds. There had also been a Democrat in the White House for 16 years already. No party has had a longer stretch of time in the White House than that since the Republicans right after the Civil War during Reconstruction. So all of the things are saying Truman's not going to win. Truman's not going to win. And of course, George Gallup's turns out fairly terrible polling also famously predicted that Thomas Dewey would win. We get the Dewey defeats Truman photograph. But when Truman calls DNC headquarters the next morning after the election is called for him, he speaks to India Edwards first, because he says he wants to talk to the person who always believed that he would win. She has an anecdote in her memoir. She published a memoir in the late 1970s, and she has an anecdote in the memoir where she recalls sitting and eating breakfast on the whistle stop train, which is where the picture of she and Truman is from. And that she's eating breakfast with President and Mrs. Truman, and that Truman looks at her and says, you know, India, sometimes I think there are only two people on this train who believe I'm going to win this election, and one of them is not my wife. So he knows very clearly that India's on his side and has his back. And she's a really, really vital part of the team. And what was so fascinating to me about this project is that I had never heard of her before I went and started doing this research. I specialize in women's political history in the United States in the 20th century. That's what my first book was about, sort of grassroots feminism in the 60s and 70s. This is what I'm working on now. So I knew if I had never heard of this woman, most people have never heard of this woman. And in fact, of the 5 women I write about, Molly Dewson was the only one I knew existed before I started this project. I went into the archives just simply wondering how presidential campaigns had pitched to women voters. And I found these women. And it's been probably one of the biggest honors that I will have at any point in my career to get to bring them back into the story. Because they were central to this pivotal part of American history, and they've been totally lost. So that's a little bit about what Edwards did during the 48 campaign. The other thing I want to talk with you all about is what she was doing the rest of the time. Because again, being head of the women's division is a permanent job. And this is the thing that she is is a little bit more known for. Before, outside of my book, there's like half of a chapter in one book that was published in the 1980s that talks about this. And she also was very involved in getting women to work, in bringing other women to work in Washington. So I want to talk about this picture first. This was my favorite picture that I found, although apologies, Azalea, that this is not a Truman Library picture. It was a newspaper picture that therefore cost me an arm and a leg to get the permissions to use, but I was determined to do it because it's such a beautiful picture. This is India Edwards hugging Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas. Douglas was a congresswoman from California. She served in the House from 1944 to 1950. She then ran against Richard Nixon. If her name rings a bell, this might be why. She ran against Richard Nixon for the California Senate seat in 1950, in which Nixon ran a sort of famously red baiting campaign, referred to her as the Pink Lady. And she loses the Senate seat and leaves electoral politics at that time. But throughout the second half of the 40s, Douglas is a rising star in the Democratic Party. She's very much in this circle of women working in Washington that Edwards is also part of. And here is this picture. Part of why I love it is just their smiles, and it's just a beautiful picture. But also what's happening here is that Douglas has just given her speech at the 48 Democratic Convention, and Edwards is about to go up on the stage and give her speech in the keynote slot on the first night of the convention. So I love them sort of wishing each other well. And so I like highlighting that there is this small group, it's usually about 8 to 10 women, this small group of congresswomen who are part of the orbit that Edwards is sort of moving in. But also, she really works hard to get women appointed to civil service jobs and to meaningful sort of policy-making civil service jobs in the Truman administration. And so all of these quotes, as you can see the citation down there at the bottom, are from an article that was published in 1951 in Coronet magazine, which I found a copy of the article and a press release about it there at the Truman Library. And I just love how the reporter, whose name is Tristan Coffin, describes Edwards' approach to getting women jobs in the administration. And these are pretty high-level jobs. This is like an assistant secretary position has opened up. How do we get somebody in there? You know, and she says the secret is to get the woman's name in a hurry to the White House before men can object and have their own candidates ready. So you got to be on the ball. And then he says, Mrs. Edwards' spies, I love that he calls them that, are made up of a host of women government executives, hostesses, and female reporters. They rush hints of job openings to her, and then she delves into her files to pull up the card and take the name across the street and map out her campaign. So she's keeping a sort of going file of all of the women who are in Washington, who are interested in this work, women around the country who have the skills necessary to sort of to work effectively in the White House and do this kind of policy-oriented work. And there are dozens of women that get appointed to sort of meaningful policy positions over the course of Truman's presidency. And that's going to be a trend that actually, it's one of the things where Edwards and Bertha Adkins, her Republican, that's one of the places where they really sort of collaborate, is that they also share this commitment to, or Adkins rather, also shares this commitment to get women in office. The last quote I want to share, and then I'll stop sharing my screen, is this quote from the end of that 1951 article, in which Tristan Coffin is talking about the possibility of India herself running for president. And she tells him that she doesn't think the country is ready for a woman president or vice president. And then he writes, if that is right, and India is usually right, she is living a generation too early for her own good. For as the politicians in the smoke-filled rooms would say, India Edwards is a natural for the ticket. And I love that quote because it also speaks to the sort of story that starts my book. A few months after this article is published, in October of 1951, President Truman calls India into the Oval Office, and he offers her the chairmanship of the entire Democratic Party, offers to make her head of the DNC in 1951. My jaw dropped when I read that. The DNC does not have a permanent female chair that serves for more than about 6 months until 2010. India Edwards got offered the gig in 1951. She turns him down. She says that the men of the party are too sexist to work for a woman, that they won't be able to get anything done. Or in her, she's a quote machine. I love the way she phrases things. As she recalled telling the president in her memoir, Mr. President, I would be so busy covering my rear that I'd never be able to move us forward. In her memoir, which again, she publishes in the late 70s, she calls turning the president down that day the biggest regret of her professional life. So now I want to see if I can get back to full screen on Zoom. Stop share. There we go. So that's just a little bit about India Edwards and the work that she did. I would be delighted to have a conversation with you about her, about some of the other women. It might be easiest, just since everybody's muted, if you either raise your hand or just type your question in the chat. If you can type your question in the chat, that might be best. Just so that we can, I can sort of patrol the chat and we can answer the questions that way, and that'll keep everybody muted and keep any feedback when you unmute to ask your question. So yeah, I would love to have, if you've got any, I'm gonna look at the chat now. Let's see. Do they also discuss women's wages? So Cornelia, thanks for that question. That is less of a focus when Edwards is there, and when Truman is in the White House, then it becomes in the 1950s. There is the Equal Pay, what will eventually become the Equal Pay Act of 1963, starts getting introduced in Congress in the mid 1950s. And President Eisenhower actually supports it pretty firmly. That was one of the other sort of surprises of my research, was finding a fairly feminist Eisenhower, who is a big supporter of women in government jobs, big supporter of the Equal Pay Act. So that's that I didn't see as much of that talk going on in the 1940s when Truman was there and when Edwards was there. In terms of the archives overall, I did the Truman Archive, Eisenhower Library, FDR Presidential Library, and then Gladys Tillett, whom I mentioned, is from Charlotte, North Carolina. Her papers are actually at UNC, Chapel Hill. So I went to Chapel Hill to look at her material. Great. Jerry's question is, what was Edwards' background? How did she learn her political skills? Her background is interesting compared to the other women that I write about. She is, as far as I can tell, and since her great niece is on here, Jeannie will tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I'm fairly certain that Edwards did not go to college. She's the only one of the five who did not. And mostly, I think she gets the impression that I have of her is that her ability to politic and her ability to sort of do this work well is in some ways just sort of a natural skill set that she has. She had spent most of her career before getting into politics, as I mentioned, as a journalist. So in terms of especially those quotes about having her file and being quick on the draw, those are skills that she certainly would have honed as a journalist. Why she specifically gets into politics. So she marries for the third time in 41 or 42, 41, I think. Her first marriage is very, very brief. She actually is widowed during World War I. Her husband is a military casualty of World War I, her first husband. And then she's married to the father of her children for a number of years. They eventually divorce. She marries her third husband in the early 1940s. He works for the diplomatic corps. They moved to Washington, and she probably would have settled into a sort of normal life as a Washington hostess, were it not for two things. Her son is killed in action during World War II in December of 1942. He's a pilot, and he's killed in a training accident. And and then in 1944, some of you who read about politics in this period may know about this. Her name just totally fell out of my head. Oh my gosh, where did the women say? Claire Booth Luce, there we go. Claire Booth Luce, who's a Republican congresswoman, wife of Henry Luce, the publisher of Time and Life. Claire Booth Luce gave this inflammatory speech at the 44 Republican convention in which she basically blamed Roosevelt for all of the war deaths. And Edwards writes in her memoir that made her determined to get into politics, to basically prove Claire Booth Luce wrong. And so that's what actually moves her into politics. Her beat in journalism, there's a question there. She was the editor of the Women's in Society page, of the Chicago Tribune. So a fairly sort of predictable kind of beat for a woman of her generation. Scrolling back up, Lauren has a question about, was I able to get any information from the DNC? So here's what's interesting that I learned. DNC records of this age do not there's no central repository of DNC records. So the DNC records for the Truman presidency are at the Truman Library. And that was the main thing that I was using. The DNC records for Roosevelt's presidency are at the FDR Library. And the Republicans are the same way. The RNC papers are at the Eisenhower Library. So I was absolutely digging through the sort of official records of the DNC and RNC. Yeah, absolutely. Any relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt? I mean, she knows Eleanor. India Edwards knows Eleanor. They're certainly moving in the same circles. There's also from the early 50s, there's a French magazine that ranks India as the third most influential women in the United States in 1951, behind the First Lady, Bess Truman, and Eleanor Roosevelt. So they certainly knew each other, but India doesn't collaborate as closely with Eleanor as her three predecessors who worked before FDR did. All of those women are collaborating very closely with Eleanor. But India sort of less so. Get a sip of water while I read back through my questions. Catherine Hatton. Hi, Catherine. Asking what happened with these Democratic women after 1948. They are active. India is active in the 1950 midterms. She's running the women's division for the 1950 midterms. She's actually works with the Stevenson campaign, which if you really want to read what somebody thinks about somebody else, you should read her take on the Stevenson campaign in 1952. She was not a fan. She was not impressed. She didn't feel like he used the women's division the way that he should have. But she's still there. She is running the women's division into 1953. But then in 1953, once the Democrats are out of the White House and the DNC is broke, totally broke, they consolidate a number of divisions. So they dissolve the women's division in early 1953. There was a very gifted headline writer at the Louisville Courier-Journal who gave the syndicated article about this that had a quote from a Democratic Party woman who's like, I'm not sure, because they said they merged women into the overall organizing of the DNC. She's like, I'm not sure that merger is the right word. I think maybe it's murder or something like that is the quote. But the headline this guy gave the article is just Democratic gals in a dither. Is it merger or murder? So merger or murder is actually the title of one of my chapters, which is pretty great as a chapter title goes. And then what's interesting is that just to sort of take the story all the way out, over the course of the 1950s, on the Republican side, even though Adkins has built a lot of the same structures, what we really see in the 50s is that campaigns professionalize. So a lot of the work that the women's division was doing in the 30s and 40s, a lot of the polling work, writing the media, I mentioned those rainbow flyers that the women's division staff writes. In 1936, those rainbow flyers make up 90% of the print media distributed by the DNC. 90%. And it's all written by women. By the 1950s, like on the campaign trains with Eisenhower and in his campaign team in 52, and especially in 56, you start seeing PR firms doing that work. There's a guy from BBDO on the train. There's a guy from Y&R on the train. I was really grateful that I watched a lot of Mad Men, so I knew what those firms were when I saw the acronyms. There's Madison Avenue PR firms that are doing the work that women had done before. So as it becomes part of a profession that doesn't have as many women in it, that women haven't had access to in the same kinds of number and same numbers, the number of women involved in this work decreases pretty substantially as we move into the 1960s. It was really interesting. I initially thought this was going to be a bigger project. And so years ago, I wrote an NEH grant, and my bibliography made my argument for me. Because at the Eisenhower, Truman, and FDR libraries, I was looking at individual women's papers. So not only the DNC or the RNC, but there's a collection of India Edwards papers there, which is where I found all the stuff I've pulled today. There's a collection of Bertha Adkins papers at the Eisenhower Library, Molly Dewson's papers at Roosevelt. JFK, LBJ, and Nixon libraries, there's no equivalent collections. There are not papers of a particular woman who was at the head of the campaigns. And it was so stark to see that in the bibliography of that grant application. So it's a system that really does decline. The whole concept of a women's division is basically gone by the early 60s. And I promise I'm going to get to the rest of the questions, but there's one other thing I want to say about this. It was a paradox, because it was a paradox I had to sit with at the end of the book, is that by 1960, this system that gave women all of this access, that gave women a seat in some of the most, important rooms in these campaigns, that system is basically dead in 1960. And in 1963, we get the Equal Pay Act. And in 1964, sex gets included in Title VII of the 64 Civil Rights Act. And we are off to the races on the most important decade for American women in terms of their treatment under the law that this nation has ever seen. And so I had to sort of figure out what's happening there. Like, when I know that there are fewer women in these rooms, how is this happening? And what I really wound up realizing is that those two things, getting women in the room and getting legislation passed are grounded in two different kinds of feminism. All of the women that I wrote about are operating from a position of what scholars call difference feminism. They believe that women are inherently different from men, and that it is because of those differences that they need to be in all of these places, that they need to be in these rooms, that they need to be in the discussions, because they are inherently different from men. Eleanor Roosevelt believed this. Eleanor hosts more than 100 press conferences over the course of her time as First Lady that are only open to female reporters. All of these women, there's a question about what kinds of colleges that they go to. All of these women went to women's colleges, that went to college. They all go to women's colleges. They believe that women's only spaces work. And that kind of difference feminism is great at getting a seat at the table. I could do a whole other riff about like the nature of mid-century pluralism, but I'm going to spare you guys that one. It's great at getting a seat at the table. It's not great as a position to argue for legislation. It turns out that just saying women are citizens and therefore should have equal rights, period, is a much more effective way of arguing for legislation. But it doesn't get you a reserved seat at the table. And both of these, so we sort of call that legislative one, we call it equality feminism. And equality feminism and difference feminism have both been present in American feminism from before there was a thing called the United States. Like you can read the sort of feminist thinkers of the founding era, and they're grappling with these two things. Both threads are always present, and they just ebb and flow over the course of American history in different ways. And it was once I figured that out, I was like, this is what's going on. I'm not talking about, there was a whole big fight. There's a brief period where someone is running the women's division before India Edwards takes over, a brief period in 46. And that person, she's a congresswoman who lost her seat in the 46 midterm. She's an equality feminist. She puts in a proposal to dissolve the women's division. And India Edwards sort of goes to her allies at the DNC and is like, this is insane. You can't do that. And then India Edwards winds up winning. But that, like, these are debates that people at the time were familiar with. This isn't sort of me just putting a framework on top of them. Alrighty, what else? Do the various committees continue to send their records to the relevant presidential libraries is a great question that I'm going to say, I guess so, but I don't actually know. I know up through, where did I look? When I thought the project was going to be chronologically enormous, certainly through Reagan. I know Reagan has the RNC stuff from the 80s. So definitely through then, yes. So I'm assuming that is still the position, that's still how NARA handles it. Is that because they have to go somewhere, right? There's federal records laws that say that these things have to go somewhere, and the somewhere that they go is going to be a NARA repository, a National Archives and Records Administration repository, like the presidential libraries. I am very grateful that presidential libraries exist, and I didn't have to go to Big NARA in College Park, Maryland, which I have lots of historian friends who have kind of horror stories about trying to work there. So I was very happy to come hang out with Azalea and the folks at the smaller libraries. All right, I'm gonna do the JFK, LBJ, and Nixon libraries have women's history stuff in general. I mean, certainly, yes, about sort of this legislation and that sort of thing. The different pieces of legislation, the different issues that they're talking about. Certainly Nixon, through his presidency, has to deal with the feminist movement, rather grumpily, deal with the feminist movement. That doesn't make him happy, but there's plenty of stuff in there about that for sure. But they don't, it's not, the women aren't in the campaigns. They aren't in the campaign material. Those that did go, so this is those that did go to college. I said they went to women's colleges. 3 of them go to private women's colleges. So Molly Dewson went to Wellesley. Dorothy McAllister went to Bryn Mawr, very sort of box standard, what you would expect here. Gladys Tillett, our one Southerner, went to the North Carolina Women's College. So she did go to a public women's college. That is what is now UNC Greensboro. That's where she went. So she went to UNC's the UNC Systems Women's College. Where she was a student of a woman named Harriet Elliott, who is a very involved in the suffrage movement in the South. Tillett herself, just for a second on her, because I'm a Southerner and it made me happy to find a Southerner in here. Tillett herself is a suffrage activist when she's in college. And then once the 19th Amendment passes, she's a founding member. I know I've got some League of Women Voters people on here. Tillett's a founding member of both the North Carolina State LWV and the Mecklenburg County the Charlotte local chapter of the League of Women Voters. New questions. Awesome. Did her outreach include African-American women? Jerry, thanks for that question. So what's interesting, and this is throughout the time that I'm looking at, throughout all 5 of the women that I'm writing about, it is very clear that when these structures are getting built in the context of the 1932 campaign, wrong president. It's late, y'all. I've had a long day. FDR has a group of people in his campaign who are targeting African-American voters. And he has a group of people in his campaign who are targeting working class voters, union households, things like that. Their understanding is that women in those 2 communities are mobilized through those identities. That's their understanding. So when Molly Dewson creates a thing called the Women's Division, she is creating something that most directly, she never says this explicitly, but you can just tell in everything that she does, most directly is reaching out to middle-class white women, certainly middle-class women. And that's because it is incredible. You can tell that because it's incredibly time-consuming. Everything that she's asking them to do takes a ton of time and a ton of effort. There is no way you could do what she's asking these women to do and have a paid job outside the home. Like, you just would not have the time. So these are definitely middle-class women. When there are African-American women who fit within the framework that Dewson has built, then they're happy to have them there. So for example, in 1936, I have records showing that there are some African-American women who are on the roster of speakers that the Women's Division will send around the country to speak to Black audiences. By the 50s, or actually in the late 40s with Edwards, there's a couple of women who write for the Black press, who work very closely with Edwards and the Women's Division to sort of get some messaging out into African-American communities. So if there are Black women that fit within the structures that they've already built, they are more than happy to have them there. But what they don't do is think about the difference that race might make in anything they're doing, in how they're structuring the work, in how they're pitching the air appeals, in anything like that. And the most telling example of this is there is a woman whose name is Crystal Bird Fawcett. She is the first African-American state woman legislator in the state of Pennsylvania. She's a state rep from Philadelphia. She's a Democrat. She coordinates outreach to Black women voters in the 1936, 40, and 44 campaigns. If you get a copy of the book, there's a picture of her at an event with Eleanor Roosevelt and Dorothy McAllister during the 1940 campaign. What was so telling to me when I got into the archives is that Fawcett is doing this work, reaching out to Black women voters. She reports to the head of the Women's Division. She reports to the head of what they in the 1940s, 30s, and 40s referred to as the Negro Division. She is not officially part of either. And when I saw that, I was like, oof, there it is, right? They can't figure out what box to put her in because she's a Black woman. And it reminds me every time I tell this story and every time I think about her, there's a classic anthology of Black feminist writing that was published in the early 1980s called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave. And every time I think of Crystal Bird Fawcett, I think of that she's like not considered in either category. Let's see. Oh, so Lauren, are the libraries super? I mean, when you're trying to get into specifics at any sort of presidential library, just because they're so, the collections are so massive, you do have to go and sort of do your own digging because they just have no way of knowing specifically what's there. I remember there's at the Eisenhower Library, somebody said they live in Abilene, Kansas. So this is my shout out. The Truman Library was great. Azalea, your colleagues did awesome work. It was lovely. But some archivist at the Eisenhower Library, like a decade before I showed up, had gone through that entire collection and made a finding aid of everything to do with women in that entire library. And it was remarkable. I had my breadcrumbs all laid out for me. I knew exactly where to go. It takes a little bit more digging. One of the things that was really interesting was figuring out the White House Central Files system, which I also worked in a lot, the paper that's being generated out of the Oval Office. The White House Central Files categorization system is the same for Roosevelt and Truman, and it's pretty similar for Eisenhower. It's got a few of its own little wrinkles, but it's close enough that I could kind of find my way in all three of those libraries. JFK Library has digitized a lot of their stuff. So when I started poking around in there, he has a totally different system. And to find anything to do with women, I had to know that I had to look under HU for human rights, and then women were subfiled under that. If you just looked for women, like you did in the other three libraries, you didn't find anything. So there are all these little quirks about figuring out where this stuff lives. And I'm sure there are things that I did not find. One of the things that I sort of like as a historian is I really like asking questions that literally nobody else has asked, like big questions, like how did presidential campaigns pitch to women voters? And that helps me not feel like I have to say absolutely everything. It helps me really think about what I'm doing as sort of the first draft of a conversation about these women. And that makes me totally comfortable to sit here and say, I know there's stuff I didn't find. And some ingenious, hardworking graduate student's going to go dig and find it and write their own book. All right, new questions. Did they develop a relationship or partnership with Women's Bureau or Department of Labor? I have a women's historian in the room. Hello. Yes, they're certainly, to Alicia's question, they are certainly working they're sort of in that world with those women. That relationship is closer actually during the Eisenhower administration than what I saw during Truman. India is really, I think because she has more of a politics and less of a policy background than a lot of the other women who hold this job. She is really laser focused on the campaign and on the politics of it. And so she is certainly talking to the head of the Women's Bureau. She's certainly, going to events that they're hosting, but there's not a close collaboration. When we get to the Eisenhower administration, they're working a lot more closely with the women in the Women's Bureau. But there's also a similar story in the 1950s going on there. A lot of that work also started to professionalize, and you're seeing fewer women in like the Department of Labor. More men are coming in as that first generation of women that set up those structures start retiring. A lot of the times they get replaced by men. My colleague, Vanessa May at college, which is one of the key is gonna, hopefully her book will be out soon, is working on that piece of the puzzle. Transition documents between them.
Well, I'm gonna let you go.
Let's see if I can get this.
Okay. All right, I'll catch you later. Okay.
Take care, Drew.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Love you guys.
We love you.
Everybody, it's not working. There we go. Okay. Transition documents, I didn't find explicit ones. But I definitely found, for example, that both India Edwards and Bertha Adkins talk about the conversations that they have, and I find letters in between them. The closest like smoking gun of a transition document I have is when Gladys Tillett became the chair in 1941. Molly Dewson, who remember is not her predecessor, who retired in 37, but still is keeping her hand in quite a bit, writes her this long, chatty letter that's really about how to manage the personalities. It's about, here's how you get on FDR's good side. Here's how you keep Eleanor in your corner. Here's what to do with, and it's not Jim Farley anymore. And at 7 p.m., I'm not going to pull up the name of the head of the DNC at that moment, but the guy who was the head of the DNC, here's what you do with him. And she just sort of gives her the scoop on how to manage these personalities. That's probably the closest thing I have to a transition document. And it's this lovely, chatty, gossipy letter about like, here is the kind of jokes that FDR likes. Here's what to say to him at dinner if he's in a bad mood to get him in a good mood. It's a great letter. Looking at my time, I don't know if we've got like, if there's one more question that somebody's got, we can do that. Or I see that some folks are peeling off as we get close to 7 o'clock. I hope this was interesting. I hope you heard things you hadn't heard. I hope at least a couple of you will buy the book because my press would be mad at me if I didn't say that. But I want to again thank Azalea for inviting me to be able to talk with you a little bit about these remarkable women. Yeah, had never heard of about any of these women. Yeah, most people haven't. That's why it's been such a great book to write. Thank you all so much. In a nod towards Dorothy McAllister having to go home to her kids, I'm gonna now say goodbye and go home and eat pizza with my 13-year-old, my 7-year-old, and my husband. But I really appreciate all of you taking the time this evening to learn a little bit about these women who really are remarkable. And like I said, it has been such a joy and such a privilege to get to bring them back into the story because they deserve to be there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Melissa, and have a great evening.
All right. Bye, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now. So bye.
Bye.